Hello and welcome to the Indian Ocean World podcast. My name is Philip Gooding. I'm a project manager and research affiliate at the Indian Ocean World Centre at McGill University. For this podcast, I'm thrilled to be joined by Professor James Beattie. Professor Beattie is an Associate Professor of Science and Society at the Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. He specialises in environmental history, garden history and history of science, as well as health history. He's particularly fascinated by the exchange of scientific, health and environmental ideas, especially between Asia and Australasia, as well as the collection of Chinese art objects in New Zealand. He is author and editor of numerous titles, including Eco-Cultural Networks and the British Empire, New Views on Environmental History, which he co-edited with Edward Melillo and Emily O'Gorman and was published in 2015 with Bloomsbury. In this podcast, we'll be discussing a more recent co-edited volume, as well as a chapter within it. The book is entitled Migrant Ecologies, Environmental Histories of the Pacific World. Migrant Ecologies was co-edited by Professor Beattie, Ryan Tucker-Jones, and Edward Melillo, and was published earlier this year with University of Hawaii Press. The chapter by Professor Beattie is entitled Chinese Resource Frontiers, Environmental Change and Entrepreneurship in the South Pacific, 1790s to 1920s. Additionally, towards the end of this podcast, we will discuss the International Review of Environmental History, an open access journal dedicated to environmental history that is published by Australia National University Press, and for which Professor Beattie is editor-in-chief. Professor Beattie, thank you so much for agreeing to record this podcast with us.
Thank you, Philip. It's lovely to be here.
I just want to start with a very open question about migrant ecologies. What was the motivation behind writing and editing this book? How did the collaboration between the three co-editors come about? And how did the project develop from those initial stages into what it eventually became?
Sure. Great question. Well, I guess there were several reasons behind how this book developed, some academic, some serendipitous, and others besides the point, such as a global pandemic. I guess we started with the basis that we all knew that each other's work, and we respected each other as people and historians. And as you'd mentioned, I'd already worked with Ted on a co-edited volume, and we'd also written a couple of papers together too, while Ryan and I had taught together and also presented and arranged and organized various symposium panels at different points in time. So for me, it was a great chance to work with Ryan as well in a sort of larger academic project. And each of us too brought particular strengths to the topic. Ryan, obviously through his expertise on the Pacific, and specifically through his earlier work on Russian whaling, and more recently on Indigenous and European whaling in the Pacific, while Ted also examined, Chile, Californian connections, as well as broader commodity histories, also to do with whaling. As for me, my focus is on Australasian Indian connections as well as sort of Chinese migrants. So I suppose we brought different strengths to this project, as well as expertise in different periods and different geographical areas. So that was a strength to start with. The fact that we all got on really well was another important consideration, and that shouldn't be overlooked either. And I guess we all came to it from a conversation that we'd had. We'd all studied Pacific environmental history, some in greater depth than others during our undergraduate and graduate years. And we found that when we were preparing our courses, we were going back to the same sources that we'd used when we first studied some 20 or more years ago. And in particular, we all discovered we went back to, again and again, John McNeill's excellent survey of the Pacific that was published in, I think, 1994. It was Of Rats and Men, a synoptic history of the island Pacific. I think that was the title. So we felt it was time to build on that work and the great scholarship that had been done in the intervening years, in the environmental history, like David Igler, Judy Bennett, Greg Cushman, Paul Darcy, Francis Steele, Mike Stevens, and so on. We wanted to, I guess, reflect these scholarly changes in an accessible format. So we felt that the best way to do that was an edited book, which brought together a lot of different voices, which we would never be able to bring together, even as sole authors, even the three of us working together. And that, I guess, was the sort of primary motivation to make this broad and expanding field accessible to an undergraduate audience and also your mythical lay reader. So I think it began in around about the early 2010s, and by 2015, Ted had organized a symposium at Amherst College where he teaches and works. And I think there were about 8 to 10 of us turned up there. So this sort of provided an initial starting point where we workshopped ideas, we explored avenues of research, and indeed, we asked the question, did we want a multi-authored book, or was a better perspective an edited collection? So we figured it was an edited collection. So in the intervening years, Ted invited and badgered a number of other contributors, so that now the book has about 15 chapters each of around about 5,000 words or slightly more each. So the idea was to make something accessible for a variety of students. So that's, I guess, the sort of the genealogy of the book's development. And before I mention that, I should also give a shout out to Masako and Hawaii University Press for supporting the project, right from the get-go. So despite the trials and tribulations and delays, thanks to COVID, they still supported the book, and it was published earlier this year, as you mentioned.
Yeah, one of the real features of the book is accessibility, and you're right, the relatively short chapters really facilitates that. In your introduction, I think you point out a lot of lessons, and most of our audience will be familiar more with the Indian Ocean world rather than the Pacific world. But the introduction itself points to a number of themes, which I think scholars of the Indian Ocean world could take on board and reflect on further. And in the introduction itself, you refer to a tension between, quote, global forces and indigenous ways of acting, valuing, and knowing. And I think this seems incredibly important, not just in the environmental history of the Pacific Ocean, which you're focusing on, but across many regions of the global south, including the Indian Ocean world. Thus, could you just kind of explain for our audience what you see this tension as being? And also, are there any broader lessons that you learned in the creation of this volume that scholars may take away and build on moving forwards?
Thanks, Philip. That's an excellent question. And I guess at a fundamental level, it's a broader question about what we as historians do, and what we in particular as environmental historians do, that tension between the local and the global. How do you situate your story into these broader patterns? I mean, it enables you to see its significance, whether it's unusual or otherwise, why its timing might be delayed, and also what the sort of environmental dimensions of these tensions between the global and the local are. And I guess, there are advantages and disadvantages, obviously, of an edited collection. One of the advantages which others see possibly as a disadvantage is the sort of multiplicity of voices. And we were careful as editors to ensure that those different perspectives were still there, but also we very tightly edited it to move it around the concept of migrant ecologies. So I guess the beauty of the edited book is that you can ask comparative questions about very different places in the Pacific, even if you didn't intend to do that as an individual author. These come out obviously in the way that these particular chapters are juxtaposed with one another. We can ask things like, how did migrant ecologies impact different places in different ways? What factors explain the differential impacts of colonialism and the environmental change in one place as opposed to another? So I'll give you some concrete examples and the way in which that sort of tension could operate. That's probably easier to do it. So, for example, my co-editor Ted's chapter examined the introduction of coffee beans from Brazil into Hawaii. And in that process, he demonstrated the crucial role played by Hawaiian, Japanese, and others in introducing coffee plantations into that group. So it's a sort of pretty complex story. It's a global story, the introduction and spread of coffee bean monocultures around the world, but the particular case study tells you a lot about, at that time at least, local power dynamics and the particular implications of coffee bean agriculture on local labor supplies, environmental impacts, and so on. But equally in the same chapter, we've got one by Melillo Solomon, who demonstrates the detrimental environmental effects of residential development on Oahu, the main island in Hawaii, and its erasure of indigenous knowledge and names. And it's a process that he manages to piece together through this careful archival research. And he uses it to recover a more holistic indigenous concept and processes that, as he sees it, can help connect land and sea and avoid some of these problems. So he uses the past to recreate it, but also to create somehow a new future. And that's a very different story to the coffee bean agriculture of a similar period. Likewise, Hannah Cutting-Jones's chapter examines how the Cook Islanders managed to resist European and colonial attempts to transform traditional land tenure and to introduce different commercially valuable crops. And one of the interesting things as a sort of historian of empire, at least that's what I used to teach at the University of Waikato, is that a focused edited collection also allows fascinating parallels to be drawn with different environmental types, but also different geopolitical centers. So the contribution from Katsuya Hirano, for example, focuses on the process of Japanese colonization in the north, and the Ainu resistance there, but also reveals the centrality of justification for this using the concept of terra nullius, which of course the British had used to displace indigenous Australians in the continent of Australia. And again, we've got a series of kind of case studies of different empires. You got the German Empire, the British Empire at different points in time, the Qing Empire, and also, the Japanese and American empires. So I guess to me, that's one of the strengths of the volume, but possibly also its weaknesses. You can pick these different themes and follow them in different chapters.
That's wonderful. And I think the fact that you've referred to chapters in your answer to that question, that kind of begs the question, where does your chapter fit in? And so your chapter, Chinese Resource Frontiers, Environmental Change and Entrepreneurship in the South Pacific, how does this fit into the broader volume? How does it help us understand more about migrant ecologies in the Pacific Ocean?
Sure, that's good question. I suppose in a sense it attempts to retell quite a well-known story, that is the impact on the Pacific Islands and peoples and resources of China's massive resource demand, which led Americans and Europeans, New Englanders and so on to try and look to resources of the Pacific to try and pay for these luxury goods that would be imported in large volumes from China. So that's part of it, to try and retell the story. But secondly, it's also to look at the role of Chinese migrants themselves, especially from the mid-19th century onwards, as agents of environmental change, to remove this sort of concept even now amongst students that Chinese were somehow these faceless workers. They attempt to give them a name, give them a history, and to give them also a degree of environmental agency. So I guess it's a sort of a perspective looking at the Pacific from possibly, my idea was looking at the Pacific from the ideas and perspectives of the Cantonese migrants who came there. And also, I confess too, I'm thinking of writing a book on the Cantonese and the Pacific and environmental change. It was a useful arena to test my ideas, a safe arena. So if my chapter got rejected, I knew that perhaps I was barking up the wrong tree.
And I think that's a really interesting contribution in terms of the kind of challenging the facelessness of, or the stereotypical facelessness of Chinese migrants. Yeah. And one of the interesting parts of your chapter is that you use biography as a way of, I think, challenging that. And I don't think I thought about it in these terms when you were writing in biography. By biography, so it's the biography that of Chu Chong. And this, I think, is an incredibly interesting methodological approach to environmental history. I think environmental history is often accused, fairly or unfairly, of not accounting for individuals or for the human, sometimes overlooking them, overgoing for the big picture, the big transformations, and often obscuring the human. And I think you've gone against this trend. And I suppose I want to know more about how did you decide to focus on this particular individual, and what patterns does his life typify, and what are the opportunities or limitations, I suppose, of this focus on the human or on a particular human for the practice of environmental history?
Yeah, it's interesting. While I was writing this chapter, I was also working on another chapter with an old friend of mine, Eugene Anderson, the historical anthropologist. And this was for the Oxford History of World Empire. And we were basically doing an overview of environmental change and the rise of empire since the year dot to now. So in part, it may well have been a reaction to this, to the need to construct a very broad, sweeping narrative with this other project. But I think also the aim of doing this was twofold. Firstly, as historians, I like to sort of see the broad picture, economic, social, cultural, in a long span of time, but also, and we capture individuals through statistics, through group, classifying them into groups and the like, but it's also important to hear the voices, to put flesh on the bones of the people that we're talking about. And this was certainly the case with Chu Chong. And I chose him for several reasons. I think, firstly, because I managed to find a reasonable amount of primary source material on him. Secondly, because he confounds the stereotype of the typical Chinese migrant as an indentured laborer. Thirdly, it demonstrates quite neatly his rootedness within a Pacific country, in this case, New Zealand. And the image obviously is of Chinese as rootless sojourners, always willing to return to China. And that's certainly true to a certain extent, but it doesn't explain people like Chu Chong or his descendants and others who still remain in the countries that they came to 150, 160 years ago. You asked about the typicality of Chu Chong. Well, he exemplified many of the patterns of other wealthy and influential Chinese merchants in Australia and New Zealand. Firstly, Chu Chong was able to graft, I suppose, colonial structures alongside Chinese markets and approaches. Secondly, he was able to move seamlessly between cultures. He was bilingual. He also married a European. Many others did too. Third, I suppose, in a sense, were the opportunities that he faced. So unlike many other of the so-called white settler lands, other than for a short period during the Second World War, aliens, including Chinese and other Asian groups, were allowed to purchase land. So he also made extensive connections with the local European community who backed his ventures. And this was typical of others. For example, the merchants down in Dunedin, Choi Su Hoi, developed basically the second major gold boom in New Zealand through dredging, through these industrialized factories that floated and scooped up gravel and processed gold. And he relied on that by dint of European investors. So it's an interesting story at this time, because it was the height of legislative racism. And it was in part to try and explore for my own interests how someone like Chu Chong was able to navigate these difficult times in which he lived. So I guess, does that sort of encapsulate an answer to your question?
Yeah, absolutely, it does. And one of the things that it complicates, I think, with a lot of assumptions, certainly that I had about this history. And one of the other things it complicates is seeing, I suppose, European and American traders as kind of dominating this region, but also dominating Chinese commercial activities during the long 19th century. And you can kind of do so by showing the vitality of oceanic trade from Canton, partly through the biography of Chu Chong. And I suppose then kind of the question that arises from this, how did Chinese migrant ecologies in the Pacific differ, or are they similar to those of the Americans and Europeans? And I suppose then the other question kind of stemming from that is, do they represent a form of colonialism? Or do you see problems with employing such a term? Does it iron out too many of the differences between the supposedly different forms of migrant ecology?
Well, I mean, that's a very good question. And I grapple with this in an article I wrote a few years ago, and I presented it in various places, and it received a pretty hostile reception in one case, because I think the individuals there didn't want to see Chinese people associated with colonialism. That was something that only white powers or the Japanese did, not them. To answer your broader question, in a sense, American and European migrant ecologies, they tapped into these existing intra-Asian trade networks, and they overlapped, obviously. So it was basically if we're talking about, say, the late 1700s, it was a sort of Johnny and Joanna come latelys of the sort of New Englanders and the Europeans who were tapping into these already existing, really vibrant coastal trading networks in Southeast Asia and along the China coast. So if we're talking about the period later, when you get Chinese migrants coming into the Pacific following the gold, in many cases, they were using the same networks, the same opportunities. They were engaging in the wholesale commodification of nature for profit. So it's a sort of definitely the same form of capitalism, but with some differences. So Chu Chong, for example, starts an early enterprise, which is basically obtaining an edible tree fungus from settlers and local Maori, paying for it, and then arranging it to be shipped and dried to Canton, where it's sold. So this obviously relies on European and Maori labor, which he paid for, but also Chinese markets and knowledge of these markets. Later on, he invests the profits that he makes from this enterprise into developing in South Taranaki, where he lived, the dairy industry. And this dairy industry was wholly reliant on, by and large, on European labor and European capital, and he sold these products to Australian and New Zealanders, and it was aimed specifically at a European market, if you like, at a settler market. And he labelled, he called his butter Jubilee after Queen Victoria's Jubilee, and so on and such like. And there was little at all evidence that it was manufactured and owned by a naturalized Chinese businessman. And that story is sort of not unique in this period too. In other respects, the networks are different. For example, there was a Cantonese mail order nursery firm in New Zealand that was open for about 50 years or more, very commercially successful. It employed Chinese and Europeans on the commercial gardens, massive glass houses, but it also owned a large plant nursery in Canton from which it obtained its seeds. So often they were making use of the same, banking systems, the same legal networks and frameworks to sue each other, to buy land, to obtain miners' rights, but also grafting onto it their own sort of cultural experiences. One classic example, I suppose, is in the construction of waterworks, where, for millennia, Chinese had been manipulating the landscape and seascape and estuaries of, the Pearl River Delta. And they brought those skills with them to Australia and New Zealand, where they were highly praised by private Europeans as well as officials who would employ them to build these water races for, in some cases, tens upon tens of kilometers to bring water into an area or to get rid of unwanted mining wastes. So I guess it's a sort of a mixture of these two different elements.
I'm going to want to ask you one final question related to your chapter, because obviously we've discussed now mostly contacts between and differences between Chinese and European migrants in the Pacific. And I wondered what kind of contacts maybe between Chinese newcomers and indigenous populations as well. And you referred to a couple of connections in your previous answer. But for example, is race, which looms so large in 19th century Euro-American and colonial imaginations, is that a useful category in analyzing the Chinese Pacific as well? Or I suppose, are there different dynamics going on here?
I mean, definitely, I've sort of hinted that already. I mean, I guess when I was sort of talking about the merchants, I had in the back of my mind David Carnadine's book on, what was it called, ornamentalism, which was arguing that class was also an important determinant of empire, not simply race. But race was certainly a vital determinant in understanding the experiences of Chinese, the way they were treated from the, in terms of the introduction, especially from the late 19th century, of a series of racially exclusionary policies that specifically targeted and tried to prevent further Chinese migration. So race is absolutely vital to understanding the experiences of on the Chinese and state racism too. But equally, I believe that as the example I gave of Chu Chong hopefully illustrates, one must also examine the issue of agency of individuals within such asymmetries of power. So certainly for the experiences of Chinese, say, that I've read about, it depended on particular circumstances. If you had I went to a mining area, it depended on whether the magistrate there was pro or anti-Chinese, how the constabulary acted, and also what the general tenor of the local newspaper were. And in some cases, there was appalling racism and discrimination, but in other cases, quite warm and cordial relations. I mean, the fact that miners on the goldfields would usually perform at New Year celebrations and at Christmas, as instrumentalists in parts of Otago, or equally that they made the largest contributions to the local hospital, suggests that there was some degree of community existing between Europeans and Chinese and other groups.
And what about in terms of relationship between Chinese populations and indigenous populations as well?
Oh, yeah.
The further dynamic.
In terms of Chinese and indigenous relationships, that depended really on the area that you're talking about. For example, I'll give you one example from New Zealand. In northern New Zealand, just below Auckland, there were a number of Chinese market gardeners there who would employ Māori women to work the gardens there, and they often intermarried and developed, family, multi-ethnic families. And indeed, one of my good friends descends from the marriage between Ngāi Tahu, so the local tribe, and Cantonese migrant. So it's more common, I suppose, at least in New Zealand, in the northern parts of New Zealand, when we're talking about, earlier on, in the late 19th century onwards. Yeah.
All right. Thanks very much for that. One of the things I also hinted at, I want to ask you about in the introduction, was that you are the editor-in-chief of the International Review of Environmental History, which is an open access journal, which for our listeners, it's open access, but also doesn't charge author processing charges. It's indexed on the Directory of Open Access Journals, and it's dedicated to environmental history. It was founded in 2015, and since 2017, it's published 2 issues per year. To my mind, it is a wonderful resource and journal. And I'm going to quickly give me a plug as well. I recently published in it as well, so of course I would say that. But for those who are listening who don't know about this journal, could you give a sense of the International Review of Environmental History's origins and the kinds of papers you're interested in receiving for consideration, and how you see the journal developing in the future? Because I said, it's a wonderful journal, and I really enjoyed reading the articles in it.
Oh, thanks, Philip, and it was a lovely contribution by you. No, I guess the origins lie well over a decade ago, when I was talking with Brett Bennett and Greg Barton, when we were talking about developing a journal such as this. And at that time, Greg was working at the Australian National University, and we received, a great deal of support from the senior scholars there, like, environmental historians Tom Griffiths and Libby Robin. And once sort of Greg left ANU, Brett and I continued to work on the proposal and, develop the ambit of the journal as well as an editorial board. And to its credit, ANU accepted it. So I've been editor for about, I think, 9 years now, along with having Brett, Emily O'Gorman, Ruth Morgan, and Andrea Gaynor as associate editors. The way we conceived it was very much a sort of a broad church. We aimed to sort of take an interdisciplinary and global approach, and also to really focus on the so-called global south, including but not limited to, Oceania, Asia, Africa, and South America. That's not to say we don't have articles from scholars or on topics related to Europe. We certainly do, but the idea was really to try and prioritize those groups of scholars who might not be able to publish in some of the other journals, which required quite heavy subscriptions in order to get there. It's obviously interdisciplinary, but we really we want things sort of ideally framed within environmental history. So we've accepted papers on everything from garden history and landscape studies, ecology, and so on. So yeah, that's just a little bit by way of background. And I mean, the journal seems to be really fulfilling its ambit. We've got over 128,000 downloads at last count, a few months ago. And I'm receiving submissions sometimes every week from all around the world, which is really, really good. But one of the challenges that we're actually now facing is the need to find funding of around about 5,000 New Zealand dollars, or I don't know, 3,000 US dollars a year to keep the journal going. So the ANU puts in a lot of money and effort, with its professional editing and publishing and what have you. But we need that sort of funding for copy editing and formatting. I'm looking at different options at the moment, but I mean, if anyone's interested in coming on as a sponsor for the journal, as it were, then please do get in touch.
Yes, please do. Finally, I want to ask the final question, which I ask all of our guests on our podcast. What are you working on now? You hinted at a book project possibly in the works, but what can we expect to see, read, or hear about from you in the relatively near future?
Great. Thanks for the question. Well, one of them is nothing to do with the environment in a sense. I was lucky enough to work as a writer on a feature-length documentary film on the sort of the Cold War period, looking at the peace movement and particular individuals' engagement with Asia and especially China, and using the arts of China to try and promote better understandings about countries and peoples which they didn't know much about. So that's called Building Bridges, Bill Yoren's Vision of Peace. And it's been in, I think, 5 or 6 North American film festivals already, which is quite cool. And I've also got a nearly completed book, which is an environmental history of the last 10,000 years of a region in Aotearoa, New Zealand, written by a couple of friends of mine, an ecologist, Bruce Clarkson, and a GIS expert, Robert Crookbane. So there'll be some really amazing illustrations, hopefully, to come out of that. And I guess it's an attempt, and again, I suppose a reaction to that really big project on global empires. It's an attempt to understand environmental impacts and interactions of different peoples, Pacific, Māori, and others across 10,000 years of history in this one little region, how it's connected globally over that period too. I've also nearly finished a book on Chinese environmental history in the Pacific, which has become, thanks to COVID, rather more focused on New Zealand than I would have wanted to, but I've only got a couple more chapters to go with that. And I'm also hoping to complete a short book on the environmental history of global empires and expansion on that other project. So if there's anyone out there, including yourself, Philip, who wants to write the sort of what happens in the 20th century to global empires, then do let me know. So yeah, they're some of the several other projects I've got on the stovetop.
Wonderful. Maybe I'll talk to you about that after recording. Wonderful. Thank you so much for discussing your research, your edited volume, your chapter, and your journal. I really appreciate it. I also want to thank Sam Gleave Riemann for organising and producing the podcast. And of course, I want to thank you, the listener, for streaming or downloading. Once again, my name is Philip Gooding, and this has been the Indian Ocean World podcast.
We would like to acknowledge the generous support of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. The Indian Ocean World podcast is produced under the SSHRC-funded Partnership, Appraising Risk, past and present. The podcast runs in conjunction with the annual speaker series of the Indian Ocean World Centre at McGill, University of Montreal.